screen. All right, so we're recording now, and these will be available to folks after the Zoom call today. So just some few little things. You can mute or turn off your video there in the left of the screen. Definitely try to keep yourself muted most of the time just to minimize that background noise. And like you're already doing, just take advantage of the chat box and enter any comments or questions, or if you need technical assistance along the way, definitely use that for that purpose. And we will try to get to everything over the course of the day. Like I said, we are recording. And my last note is be kind. We are all taking on the Zoom thing, and we've got a lot of partners that are working hard today, and wish us luck in the Zoom world, and hopefully we have no strange snafus today. You can go to the next one, Ryan. And then just wanted to note some of the awesome partners that are at the table. The Living Shoreline Collaborative is a growing group, and I wanted to give a special shout out to these folks you see on the screen that have really worked hard to come up with the agenda for today and dealing with all those little details. So thanks to VIM, CBF, DCRCs, the City of Hampton, City of Norfolk, Bay Environmental, the Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professional Program, Colonial Soil and Water Conservation District, Elizabeth River Project, us at James River Association, and Wetlands Watch. And then of course, we got to thank the folks who are helping us put this on financially with National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Virginia Environmental Endowment. You can go to the next one, Ryan. And just a quick look at the agenda. I think you received this in an email, but just to kind of know where we're going today, we're doing a little welcome, and you're going to hear from Emily in a moment with an overview of what the Living Shoreline Collaborative is and what we have in the horizon. We're going to be doing a short networking breakout room session where you could just get to meet a few other folks that are on the call today. We're going to hear from the state and agency updates, have some breaks throughout the day. We're going to have a great lunch break. Unfortunately, again, we don't have free lunch for you today, so we apologize for that. And let's see, in the afternoon portion, we're going to be hearing about some success stories and some highlights from the collaboration. And then have some time at the end for any upcoming Living Shoreline opportunities. And you can go to the next. And I think at this point, I think I'm passing it over to Emily. Yep. So Emily Hinson is going to give you a little intro to the collaborative.
Awesome. Thank you, Amber.
Yep.
So hi, everybody. I'm Emily Hinson. I'm the Lower James Regional Outreach Manager for the James River Association. So I manage JRA's Living Shoreline program, and I kind of play the role of unofficial coordinator for the Living Shoreline Collaborative. So thank you so much for joining us today. And while I wish we could do this in person, one bright spot of using this virtual format is that we were able to accommodate a much larger crowd than we were at last year's summit. So I'm glad to be able to do that. Looking over the registration list, I saw that we had quite a few folks who attended last year's summit, as well as some newcomers. So I'll give a brief overview of the Living Shoreline Collaborative, as well as some of our next steps that I'm really excited to share about. So the Living Shoreline Collaborative is as it says on the slide, is a group working together to scale up resilient practices, primarily living shorelines in the tidal James watershed. And so JRA serves as the convener for the collaborative, since we are a watershed group with that specific geographical focus on the lower James. And you can see from the map here, the boundaries of our watershed. When we talk about the lower James, what we're talking about is sort of the tidally influenced area from the fall line in Richmond to the mouth of the James at Fort Monroe. So our watershed includes parts of many different localities, many cities and counties, and it's really not a homogeneous landscape. From a development perspective, we have rural areas, urban areas, and everything in between. Our shorelines vary a lot as well. Some are, dominated by agriculture, and others are really residential communities or even business and industry. So, our shorelines are quite diverse in the sense that they include freshwater, towards the western part of our watershed, and it gets more and more brackish, and the plant communities are changing because of that. So in some areas we have 30-foot cliffs along the shoreline, and in other areas, it's just generally really low lying. So, I bring this all up because I think that's what makes Summit's list one so valuable, because in order for the collaborative to achieve its goals, we kind of need all of these different perspectives present. So Ryan, if you could go to the next one, thank you. A little bit about the goals of the collaborative. So this is a list that we created as a group back in 2018. And you can read the goals off the slide, but there are a few points I'd like to highlight. We do emphasize here connecting partners. So some examples of this will be highlighted in this afternoon section about living shoreline collaborations and mentorship. Another focus is on creating a place for knowledge sharing. So, I think that's what we're shooting for with this morning's breakout sessions that we have lined up. And lastly, we want to ensure that we're considering shoreline restoration in kind of the larger context of coastal resilience and sea level rise, and keeping that in mind. Next slide. Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. So I have here some highlights from the various projects that the collaborative has worked on. The top set of, you can really see that this is like from the before times, with everyone standing so close to each other and like sharing writing implements on that on that one sheet. But the top set of photos is from last year's summit, and our theme was State of the Shorelines. So we were really focusing on hearing from participants about the barriers to living shorelines that they're seeing, as well as the opportunities that they see. We have a shot from one of our workshops at the lower left side of the screen, where we focused on living shoreline design. So we had marine contractors and locality staff come out for that workshop in Surrey, Virginia. And then on the lower right, we have a project that was installed last year in Isle of Wight, which is going to be one of 3 demonstration projects that we're in the process of installing on the south side of the James. So, I should mention that all 3 of those demonstration projects are being installed by Bay Environmental. They were designed and will be installed by them. Next slide. So, I wanted to take a moment to look forward at our future plans for this group. And I'm excited to share that this past fall, we were awarded a grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation through their Innovative Nutrient and Sediment Reduction Program. So, as we've been working as a collaborative, we have identified many areas that need more attention and time and funding to attain our goals for living shorelines in the lower James. And so this proposal really focused on expanding the collaborative. And we've identified several areas that I'll get into in a minute to kind of focus our efforts. And different partners of the collaborative are really taking the lead on different aspects of this project. So, I've listed here some of the main partners that were key in writing and submitting this proposal, but there are many more not listed that have been a part of this greater effort. And Ryan, could you go to the next slide? Thank you. So, I've outlined here 3 main themes that we're looking at as we expand the Living Shoreline Collaborative. And I want to preface this by saying that this is very early days for this part of the initiative. So, we're presenting sort of the broad strokes of what we would like to accomplish in these 3 areas. One of the things that I've included in the summit evaluation that you all will fill out at the end of the day is asking whether you'd be interested in participating in or contributing to a specific team. So we're really just trying to gauge interest, but just fair warning, we're not at the point where these teams have been formalized and we're signing up a list of members. So with that said, I'll share a little bit about the implementation team, since JRA will be playing a large role with that. And then I'll hand it off to Karen During from BIMS and Shireen Hughes from Wetlands Watch to cover the other 2 initiatives, since those organizations are really going to take the lead there. The implementation team's focus will really be about, getting projects in the ground. So that means coordination amongst assistance programs that are, already out there. We also recognize the importance of extending the lifetime of existing living shoreline projects through maintenance. So that will also be a focus of this team. Outreach to homeowners is closely tied to installing projects in residential areas. So that will be a component as well. And lastly, we're working with the Colonial Soil and Water Conservation District to partner on some larger living shoreline projects on agricultural land. So some of the collaborative partners that will be involved with this kind of implementation effort will be the Elizabeth River Project, the Shoreline Erosion Advisory Service, part of DCR, and the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. And as I mentioned earlier, the Colonial Soil and Water Conservation District. So that's the implementation team. And if we go in the order that the slide has it, then I'm going to hand it off to Karen During from BIMS to share a little bit about the direction that the monitoring team is going.
Thanks, Emily. Good morning, everyone. It's really good to see everyone here this morning for this next summit. The monitoring team is going to be working on a couple of things. First of all, just sort of assessing where all the projects are located that Emily was just describing. There's quite a few new projects that are coming online, but there's already a lot of projects already on the ground. So this team will be in charge of sort of tracking and cataloging where all of the living shoreline projects are located in the lower James. And then we're also going to work on developing low-cost living shoreline monitoring protocols to standardize data collection across different sectors. We know that the regulatory program does some monitoring for compliance purposes. The grant funding projects have to be tracked to report to the granting agencies. The Elizabeth River Project and the James River Association are monitoring their projects in a certain way. My colleagues at VIMS, myself, Christine Tomlinson, who's here today, we are tracking living shorelines, primarily looking at permitting records. So there's a variety of different monitoring efforts going on, and we'd like to sort of take advantage of the collaborative to work together as a team to leverage the monitoring that everybody's doing, share the results of the monitoring, and adaptively manage the implementation process, the design process, and the training team that Shireen will tell you a little bit about. And we want to have this protocol be sort of a crowdsourced type setting where the ability to monitor living shorelines isn't limited to professionals or academics. It will extend to property owners and citizen scientists as well.
Hi, everybody. This is Shireen Hughes from Wetlands Watch. And I also am the Virginia coordinator for the Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professional Program. And I am, and Wetlands Watch is the lead on the training team. We're going to be working with Elizabeth River Project, BIMS, James River Association, and anybody else that has expertise in living shorelines in the area. We invite you to join us in developing a training for living shoreline professionals and contractors. One of the things that we hear when we talk about living shorelines is we get the question, who can we hire to do the work? Who can we hire to design them? Who can we hire to install them? And where can we find them? How do we connect with them? So we're going to try and, first of all, create a program that's consistent and provides good quality training for contractors that also connects professionals with living shoreline opportunities. And our hope is to develop this through the CBLP program as a certificate program, for certificate training program. And then also we'll be aligning with the monitoring effort and training the professionals to do monitoring on the living shorelines. So first step will be to just recruit the technical experts within the area who have experience to help us develop this program, and we'll be hoping to pilot it in late 2021 or early 2022. Thanks for your time, and please contact me if you're interested in being involved in this.
Yeah, thank you, Shireen and Karen. And it looks like, looking at the chat box, we have quite a few questions popping up. But we are going to move on to the next section. Thanks, Ryan. So Amber, would you mind copying those questions into the chat box so that people can hold on to them once they're in their breakout rooms?
Yeah.
Awesome. So one thing that we find valuable, that we found valuable at our last summit was sort of the opportunity to network and get to know new people. So we're going to set up breakout rooms to try to emulate that. If you have not used a Zoom breakout room before, in a moment you will be sent to a smaller group. So hopefully everybody will be able to talk and participate. We've got these questions that Amber is copying into the chat box. So you should still have those in your chat box even after you've been split up into breakout rooms. And
I'm working on typing them in.
oh, they should be in the run of show if you want to copy them. Either way.
There you go.
Yeah. So basically, we just want folks to sort of introduce themselves, just some questions to get the conversation going. And we're going to take about 20 minutes for this exercise. Amber, do you want to open up the rooms?
Yep, I've got the rooms. You'll be automatically assigned, and I'm going to open them now.
For that talk later.
Awesome. Amber, do we still have anyone left in breakout rooms, or are we all back?
Oh, I
Should
think
be all that. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Well, yeah, I hope people got to meet some new folks. So we had a great discussion in our room about Living Shoreline funding programs, as well as some upcoming projects going on in the area. So hope everyone got some value out of that. We're gonna move on to the agency updates, and then after that we'll have a stretch break. So, you know, I'm happy to introduce Skip Stiles. Skip, are you here? He's somewhere in here. Okay, great. So Skip is the executive director of Wetlands Watch, and so he's going to be moderating this next segment on agency updates. If anybody caught the webinars that Skip did over the summer on the legislative changes around living shorelines and wetlands, you know that he's very well versed in the subject. So he's going to be introducing this segment. So Skip, if it's all right, I'll hand it off to you now.
Okay.
And you should be able to share your screen if you have any slides to share.
Yes, I do. Hold on a sec. Why am I not, is it, I keep my sharing screen is, there we go. Sorry about that. All right, I'm going to give a brief overview of some of the changes that are taking place, give you the sort of the 20,000 foot view of the things that are happening, because last year was a major change in the way the state is addressing a lot of these issues, and they're now being implemented. We'll hear about those from some of the speakers in a bit. So in the last legislative session, there were a lot of, this is the last one being 2020, there were a lot of changes. The reasons being the legislature changed leadership, and so a new agenda was on the table. The second piece of it was the administration had a resilience strategy that they wanted to implement, and so there was a really coordinated effort to bring some new legislation, some new changes. But mostly what's happened over the last couple of years is the flooding has become a constituent issue and not a policy debate. And what I mean by that is there are a lot of wet, angry people out there in Stanton, which flooded 3 times this summer, in coastal Virginia, and they're going to City Hall and the County Administrative Building demanding changes. And so what's happening is this issue has sort of lost its a lot of the controversy from the past because people just want solutions now. And I think that's what we saw in the last legislative session. There were a number of major changes. I'll go through each of these quickly, and the couple of the speakers will address these, but we created Chief Resilience Officer. DEQ had climate change added to its mission, as well as environmental justice. The Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act is now to include coastal resilience and adaptation. VMRC was given some new mandates on living shorelines and climate change. And then a major initiative that I'll go into in a little detail, there was a fund set up statewide, the Community Flood Preparedness Fund, which will begin kicking off this year. So in 2020, there was a legislative change to create a Chief Resilience Officer. The reason for this was there was a strong feeling, a valid feeling, that the state was not coordinating its resilience efforts across government. So Department of Health and Department of Transportation were doing things differently from the Secretariat of Natural Resources. And so this Chief Resilience Officer position was created in an attempt to coordinate things government-wide in Virginia. We'll see how well it works, but now we've got a Chief Resilience Officer. The second big change that was made was that climate change was added to the purpose of the Department of Environmental Quality. And essentially, DEQ is now to ensure that climate impacts and climate resilience are taken into account across all programs and permitting processes. This is the big change here. This means every permitting process in DEQ, air, water, waste, everything is supposed to be taking climate change into account going forward. And we've looked around and we can't find another state that has made these kind of sweeping changes, trying to put a dynamic condition like climate change into what have been fairly static and fixed regulatory programs. So this is going to be quite a challenge for the state going forward, and something that everyone on this webinar needs to keep track of. The second piece in the same bill, environmental justice, was added to the purpose of DEQ. And so I think going forward, there's going to be some significant changes in the way that outreach and public engagement is done. And so I think we've all got to watch those changes as well. As I mentioned, the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act had added to it a purpose of coastal resilience and adaptation to sea level rise and climate change. And Justin Williams will be talking about this in just a bit. But this is another big change as the Chesapeake Bay Act is supposed to now take resilience and climate change and sea level rise into account. Some draft regulations have been issued that are out for comment now that Justin will talk about in a bit. The other big change that was made, bill by Senator Lewis, very apropos to this meeting, living shorelines are now the default approach to shoreline erosion control unless best available science indicates it won't work. So essentially the burden of proof has been changed, And if you want to do a bulkhead or a riprap, you have to prove that living shorelines won't work. This is sort of similar to what the Fairfax County Wetlands Board had done a number of years ago, where they made living shorelines the default option, and basically you had to prove that you couldn't do it in order to get a conventional method of shoreline erosion control. The issue is going to be what the best available science is. And this is something that Randy and the folks at BMRC are working on, and we'll hear about that in a bit, because standards are being developed now to help local wetlands boards decide how to make these decisions. The second piece of this was that this bill added, essentially added sea level rise to the tidal wetlands permitting program. And this change has been sort of put on hold for the time being, I think. Because essentially what we've got in Virginia is a chance to coordinate both the Chesapeake Bay Act and the tidal wetlands permitting at the same time, and make them or have them include climate change and sea level rise in their permitting. So this is a tremendous opportunity that right now is not being coordinated, but we're hoping that going forward these programs can be brought together so that the whole ecosystem, from lower mean water to the back end of the resource management area and the Chesapeake Bay Act, can be acting under this, can be driving us towards the same set of end conditions. The last piece of this I want to talk about is that Virginia is now joining the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is a market-based CO2 market that extends from New England now down to Virginia. And in selling these CO2 credits, funds are generated, and there will be an auction in a few weeks in early March that will be the first that Virginia participates in. It'll start generating funding for the state. Half of that money will go to a low-income energy efficiency program, and 45% of that money will go into a statewide community flood preparedness fund. And it's expected this year that these credit sales will generate $75 million. So we're talking about a $75 million flood fund for Virginia, which is a significant source of funding for the state. The flood fund will be administered by DCR, Department of Conservation and Recreation. Guidelines are being developed. The interesting thing is the money for this fund is non-reverting. In other words, it doesn't expire at the end of the fiscal year. And it's also non-appropriated money. So it's separate from the general fund. The monies can be used for a number of things, but state and regional significant studies are one of the things that is the purpose of the fund. As I say, the fund is statewide, covering riverine and coastal flooding. Most of the focus of the fund is to get money into localities to implement flood prevention and protection projects and studies in areas that are currently flooding or that will flood in the future. So that's the main purpose of the fund, is to try to get money on the ground into these areas. There's a special emphasis on getting a 25% set aside for low-income geographic areas that are defined in the statute. This is important for this group. Priority will be given to projects that implement community-scale hazard mitigation and activities that use nature-based solutions to reduce flood risk. So we have a statewide fund, $75 million, and we have an emphasis here on nature-based solutions. So I think we all need to watch this fund as it's being developed and implemented. There's a provision in here that allows loans to individual property owners for resilience work. So some of this, if the localities opt into this, some of this money could be used for living shoreline work as well. We're not certain, localities are not real keen on operating a loan program, so we're not sure how much this will be used going forward, but we'll see. Guidelines are being developed now. The grant manual will be developed within a few weeks. There are significant challenges getting the local project program, getting money on the ground in local areas off the ground in the near term. DCR is still looking for staff. A lot of the localities are not ready to participate. But going forward, this will be significant. I think what will happen the first year is we'll see a lot of money being devoted towards these studies of statewide significance. For example, it's now generally recognized that we've got more intense rainfall, as much as 20% increase in rainfall intensity. The state is going to update its rainfall estimates. This requires a study to be done. The riverine areas are woefully inadequate. Stream gauge network is being exposed in the flooding that's occurring in the riverine areas. Some of that work will be done. A lot of flood inundation and modeling work. So a lot of the early money, I think, is going to be spent preparing for and helping localities address some of these changes going forward. So the coastal region is better prepared for the fund. We have localities developing plans. The Coastal Zone Management Program is providing capacity grants. There's been a technical advisory committee that's been set up providing priorities. And the state is spending a couple $1 million to develop a coastal master plan. So coastal region, I think, is pretty well prepared to deal with this. Riverine areas, not at all. And this is one of the areas where I think we need to focus a lot of attention for this fund, is making sure that the riverine areas, the areas essentially west of 95, are prepared, because right now there aren't many state resources being devoted to them. So this is a very complicated time. I will point you to two web pages that we have. One, the first one, Virginia Policy Updates. We track all of these changes and are posting updates and background materials as it goes on. We also have an occasional periodic newsletter that we're putting out called the Commonwealth Resilience Brief that you can sign up for, that will help keep you informed on some of these changes. So that is pretty much what I've got going forward. What I'm going to do now is, and someone here may have to help me, I want to turn things over to our other speakers. We have three very good speakers this morning. Aaron Wendt, who's a shoreline engineer with SEAS, the Shoreline Erosion Advisory Service, is going to talk about progress towards the watershed implementation plan goals in the James River Basin. Justin Williams will follow. He's the director of the Office of Watersheds and Local Government Assistance. He'll talk about the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act changes. And then Randy Owen, who's the deputy chief of the Habitat Management Division, will talk about the work that VMRC is doing. We're going to hold questions till the end. There'll be a question period at the end. But if you have one burning, clarifying question at the end of each of these speakers, let us know. And you can put the questions in the, is there a Q&A box? I'm a presenter, so I see a chat box, but there should be a chat and a Q&A box, and we will monitor questions there as we go along. So with that, I would like to turn.
Sorry, really quick. So
Yeah.
just a clarification. This version does not have a Q&A box, but if you enter your questions into the chat, we can keep track of them as well.
Okay, we got chat. Okay, and we will be monitoring the chat. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Aaron to talk about the WIP implementation in the James River.
All right, can you hear me? Let's try the share screen feature here. Let's see here. All right, can you see my screen? Excellent, I see at least one thumbs up. All right, so let's talk about shoreline management, the Chesapeake Bay Tmdl Watershed Implementation Plan, and focus it down on progress we've made here in the James River Basin. Let's see here. Just so everybody knows where I'm coming from, I'm with Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation. We help Commonwealth citizens enjoy the outdoors while we help to conserve the outdoors and protect the outdoors. And those not familiar with SEAS, we're a shoreline erosion advisory service. And I'll talk more about this in our breakout session on technical assistance and financial incentive programs a little later. So to help us all get thinking the same way here on a few topics about shoreline management and erosion, just some reminders here. I think we all realize that erosion is a natural process, and primarily it's wind-driven waves that combined with currents and sea level rise that push our erosion here in Virginia. You know, erosion does have positives. It feeds sand to our beaches and it helps our marshes accrete sediment so that they can attempt to keep up with sea level rise. But of course, excess sediment and the nutrients associated with it can negatively impact SAV. A USGS report from 2003 suggests that shoreline erosion accounts for as much as 57% of the total sediment load to the Chesapeake Bay. And I like to tell this little fact down here to whenever we are talking with property owners that, you know, some Virginia shorelines are losing 30 feet per year on the average, and some gain as much as 10 feet per year on the average. So of course, we know there's a spectrum of solutions our property owners can implement, ranging from the very gray bulkheads to green marshes. And of course, last year at the summit, if those of you on were there, we spent a little bit of time talking about ecosystem benefits, the co-benefits, the things we get out of living shorelines in that focus. So we've all seen this, I think, in the past, but again, just to help bring our minds to point here. Water quality benefits, habitat for fish and wildlife, the coastal resiliency benefits, hardened structures like bulkheads can prevent marsh migration. So let's talk about the WIP. So if you're not familiar, the Chesapeake Bay total maximum daily load is focused on restoring water quality in Chesapeake Bay, and it looks at nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. And so the states across the bay developed watershed implementation plans, or WIPs, to help guide each state's actions to achieve those water quality targets in the Tmdl. So here in the Commonwealth, we are now on our phase 3 WIP. It was released in mid-2019, and it's going to guide our actions to the end game. The end game here, the end target timeframe is 2025. It's a multi-sector blueprint that includes BMPs for a whole whole cluster of pollutant source sectors. It has targets, numeric targets for nitrogen and phosphorus reductions, and that's focused on meeting dissolved oxygen goals in the bay. Sediment is dealt with a little differently in the WIP. There aren't any targets that are really goals. Rather, the sediment targets are based on the realizations of what the WIP is going to implement, and that's just a nature of sediment's not really the main driver for the dissolved oxygen or even the water clarity goals. The water clarity is the SAV responds perhaps more to algae and nutrients in the water. So sediment's not really a primary driver for implementation. Before we look at some numeric targets and goals in the WIP, you know, the process that the Commonwealth went through to develop this phase 3 WIP was pretty intense. Lots of discussions with the PDCs, the soil and water conservation districts, as well as you know, individuals were participating in that, and over 500 ideas and suggestions. There were kind of like 6 themes that evolved in those discussions, and one of those top 6 themes focused on enhancing living shorelines to address shoreline erosion. So in the chapter 7 of the WIP, there are statewide policy initiatives. None of them explicitly use living shorelines or shoreline management in the title, but I put 8 of them on here that you probably need to pay attention to and track, because they have elements of shoreline management associated with them. Of course, number 1, I'm going to talk about here a little bit more, the numbers on enhancing BMP reporting. There was a lot of discussion about shoreline data and reporting that shoreline data to DEQ and EPA. The 4th one there, when you read it in the WIP, it really talks more about efforts by DGIF, now Department of Wildlife Resources, and their goals for implementing the state wetland targets, both both tidal and non-tidal fresh wetlands, but the Hog Island Wildlife Management Area, they're working on a large living shoreline there with Ducks Unlimited, and so that was fortunate for us and our goals here in the James that's in our basin. Skip already mentioned the Coastal Resiliency Master Plan and its connection to natural and nature-based features, and so there's some discussion in there about how living shorelines connect. And there's a couple agricultural sector policy initiatives that tie back to living shorelines, and one of them has to do with the Ag BMP loan program. Another one has to do with Ag cost share program, and both of those talk about more in depth in that breakout session on technical and financial assistance. But those bring financial incentives to bear for living shorelines to ag producers. There's also a narrative policy initiative to support the growth of private sector native plant nurseries. And that could conceptually include nurseries that are growing in alternate flora and salt meadow hay for marsh restoration tied to living shorelines. And that this WIP goal talks about economic development monies that VDAX has available that could support this WIP goal. Moving to developed lands, both non-MS4 and MS4 areas, there's a couple initiatives in there, and one supports VCAP, which we'll also hear, the Virginia Conservation Assistance Program, which is a residential homeowner cost share program, and we'll hear more about that in that breakout session as well a little later. But then there's also a WIP target about enhancing marketing of funding opportunities. And when you read the narrative, it really talks about things like SLAF, the Stormwater Local Assistance Fund. And if you glance at things, it doesn't explicitly say that living shorelines are or aren't allowed. But when you read the guidelines, there's discussion about how to calculate the load reductions from living shorelines. So theoretically, we can get some living shoreline money through SLAF perhaps. So moving forward to the numeric goals that are in the WIP. The WIP, well, really the Tmdl itself and its modeling efforts categorize shoreline erosion in the natural source sector. So we know that the land use could be agricultural or it could be urban, but for the purposes of the WIP and the model, it's categorized in the natural pollutant source sector. The WIP does break up the state into the 5 major basins and organizes all of the numeric WIP goals for all the BMPs by those 5 basins, the Potomac, Rappahannock, York, James, and Eastern Shore. I will say that again, for the purposes of the WIP, the Lynn Haven and areas down here between Norfolk and Virginia Beach, those are all included in the James Basin from the perspective of the WIP. And so you can see there that the goal in the WIP for shoreline management across tidal Virginia is 500,000 linear feet of shoreline management implemented between mid-2019, or really up until 2025. And you can see the James there. It's about 15 miles for a goal for the James. And so, it's not the smallest, but it's definitely not the largest there like Rappahannock or York. So how do we get to documenting what we've done with shoreline management? The process for the WIP and reporting any BMP is the Chesapeake Bay program has this expert panel process where they convene a group of scientists and experts in the field, and they develop protocols and methods to estimate the pollutant reductions from, in this case, shoreline management. And, we were lucky enough here in Virginia to have Pam Mason and Scott Hardaway, both from VIMS, serve on this expert panel and provide their expert input as well as Virginia's perspective, I think, to this process. This expert panel report laid out some basic qualifying conditions for shoreline management to be credited to the WIP goals. And if you can see the fine print in this table from that panel report, you'll notice that bulkheads and seawalls are eligible for crediting to the WIP, as well as revetments and breakwaters that aren't living shorelines. But of course, living shorelines, both structural and hybrid living shorelines, are eligible. And so the conditions for a bulkhead are very specific. So, you know, it would have to be like at a port facility, and living shoreline is not appropriate there, technically feasible. It's got to be deep water nearby. So there's some conditions that have to be met for that to be an eligible practice for crediting to the WIP. And you can see there the same thing for revetments and breakwaters. The living shoreline has to be not technically feasible, and there can be no impacts to SAV and other aquatic habitats. So the easiest and quickest one to meet the conditions, of course, are living shorelines here. That panel provided, I say 5 protocols, 1 through 4, and I usually say the default protocol when I'm talking. Down at the bottom there, it's labeled non-conforming or existing practices. And so the methodology to report our living shoreline and shoreline management efforts is basically through this table. And so if you have a shoreline where all you know about is the linear feet of shoreline protected, you've got to use that default protocol down at the bottom. But if you know more about your site, like the historic erosion rate, the average bank height, how much marsh grass, new marsh grass is being planted, you can use those other protocols 1 through 4 to get perhaps a more accurate, realistic, and perhaps better load reduction.
Hey, Aaron.
Yes.
Just really quickly, maybe a 2-minute warning.
Yep, we're there.
Thanks.
Yep,
Awesome.
thank you. So that has been updated several times by EPA and the Chesapeake Bay program. There's a way to do that formula. We don't need to get into that. And so the 2020 progress BMP data from the Chesapeake Bay program isn't quite available on CAST yet. Everybody submitted their data to DEQ last fall. And so I'm going to talk here about DCR. We've submitted nearly 1,200 sites statewide to the database for about 46 miles of protected shoreline. Again, these are load reductions, credits, nearly 18,000 tons of sediment, 31,000 pounds of nitrogen, and so forth. And so here's the numbers for the goal. So the goals, again, in the WIP aren't for necessarily the nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. The goal is for the 500,000 linear feet. You can see here what we got reported for the James, nearly 80,000 feet, if I remember correctly from what I wrote down last year when we talked about this. It was about 42 or 43,000 linear feet, and it was like 55% of the goal. So you can see from a percentage of the goal, the James is doing the best right now as far as reporting shoreline management. And you know, I think we have a lot of large projects that we know about going on across the lower James, as well as a lot of landowner projects that are being in the design or construction phase right now. And so I think we're lined up well to achieve that target and goal. So that's where we're at.
Great, thank you, Aaron. We're going to move on now to Justin Williams. Justin's the director of the Office of Watersheds and Local Government Assistance Programs at the Department of Environmental Quality. And Justin's going to talk to us about the implementation of that provision that I talked about that attempts to put climate change, resilience, sea level rise, and everything else into the Chesapeake Bay Act. So, Justin, you're good.
Hey, good morning, and hopefully everyone should be able to see the PowerPoint. Great. Thank you again, Skip, for the introduction and for the partners for allowing the opportunity for me to present this morning. There's a lot going on currently in the CBPA arena as it relates to climate adaptation measures, as Skip mentioned, and I'm going to focus in particularly with some of the regulatory amendments that we have underway in light of some of the legislative changes that happened to the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act. So as Skip mentioned briefly, and I'll provide some more specifics on, the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act was amended by the 2020 General Assembly. Specifically, there was an amendment to the provision related for the State Water Control Board to develop criteria for local governments and their programs, and specifically within that provision added 2 criteria to the existing requirements. One was to promote and encourage coastal resilience and adaptation to sea level rise and climate change. And the other was to incorporate preservation of mature trees or planting of trees as a water quality protection tool and as a means of providing other natural resource benefits. The proposed regulatory amendments to incorporate these changes did go to the State Water Control Board in December. There was a authorization by the State Water Control Board to put those proposed regulatory amendments out for public comment for 90 days, in addition to including other requirements for the convening of a stakeholder advisory group, which will help to consider comments, the proposed regulations, and provide recommendations prior to any final proposed regulation going back to the State Water Control Board, likely in June. The public comment period for these regulatory amendments is actually currently underway. It began February 1st and is open until the end of the day on May 3rd. If you haven't or want to have an opportunity to look more specifically at the language or to submit comment, these proposed regulatory amendments are available on Town Hall as well. So I encourage you to go to Town Hall, and you can see both the proposed text specifically, as well as some information for submitting comments. After the close of the public comment period, we will have a stakeholder advisory group, and that meeting will occur in May. We also had the fortune, concurrent to this activity with the legislative change, but actually proposal submitted prior to, was to receive grant funding from NOAA. To be able to engage VIMS and the William & Mary Coastal Policy Center on assistance with addressing climate adaptation under the CBA program, specifically related to guidance and technical assistance. So pursuant to that grant, that work is now underway. In addition to helping to provide guidance development subsequent to the final adoption of the regulatory amendments, they'll be providing technical assistance, and part of that work is beginning now as VIM's looking at GIS technical work for the forecasting of water features and buffers and the analysis of measures specific to climate adaptation options or measures that may be undertaken, and specifically looking at the water quality impact analysis and looking at runoff and load reductions. So the one amendment that I mentioned previously,
Justin, can other people hear him?
No.
Justin?
No, do not.
Hear you.
No, just is clicking or something.
It wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without a little technical glitch.
I believe I'm back. I don't know what happened there, but hopefully, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, we can hear you again.
Okay. So apologies for that. Let me go back to where I was. So the next provision that I want to focus some more time on is actually that regulatory amendment related to climate adaptation. And the proposed amendment that was crafted here creates a new subsection under the CBEPA regulations. And the goal there was to really condense in one place the provisions related to incorporation of climate adaptation and resiliency. Because this criteria is criteria that's required to apply for local programs where the localities are the ones who actually implement the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act and those requirements, it gives a 3-year time frame for incorporation by those localities. Importantly, it actually, for the first time, recognizes climate adaptation measures as an allowed activity in CBPA areas. And this is important, of course, because particularly as it relates to resource protection areas, there are defined activities that can occur within an RPA, and this provides recognition of climate adaptation measures as one of them. Also, the provisions include consideration of climate change impacts into the plan reviews that are being undertaken by localities. And that occurs through the use of a model or forecast specifically that incorporates the NOAA 2017 Intermediate High Projection Curve and looks out for a 30-year time frame. Based upon this review of the model or forecast in that time frame, it then gives the localities the ability to incorporate conditions, measures, or alterations to the proposed site plan review to take into account the potential impacts from climate change within that proposed plan. There's also provisions that provides for the limitation of exceptions being granted by localities, specifically as it relates to limitations on the seaward buffer side, the sole use of fill, and for plan reviews that don't consider or address climate change. It also provides and outlines specifically criteria for the climate adaptation measures that are allowed within the area. And here the distinction primarily comes between undeveloped and developed lands, with an emphasis on utilizing the same provisions that already exist for criteria, which includes maximizing the preservation of existing vegetation or incorporating natural features, requiring approvals at the local, state, and federal levels, such as other permits, as well as minimizing the potential impact from those measures. One of the other items that we looked at and incorporated was to reduce the water quality impact assessments and the requirement to have those assessments for climate adaptation measures in the RPA, where the measure also is a non-point source BMP, so where there's overlap to both address potential impact from runoff as well as to address climate change. There was an exemption provided there on the WQIA part. More specific to our discussion today is we did outline a specific opportunity for reducing requirements for living shorelines, and provided a specific provision addressing living shorelines. Under the proposed provision, a living shoreline is exempt from the other criteria in water quality impact assessment where that project is already approved by the locality. It maintains or establishes a vegetative buffer inland of the shoreline to the maximum extent practicable. It minimizes land disturbance to the maximum extent practicable, and it receives approval from BMRC, including a permit as applicable. And really the goal here was to recognize the encouragement of the installation of living shorelines as well as the jurisdictional overlap, which Skip alluded to as well in his presentation, and providing a balance there consistent with the overall policy and intent of the CBPA. Certainly, given the audience and the collaborative here today, I encourage folks to take a look at those provisions, both generally and of course the reference to the living shorelines, and provide us any comments or feedback during the public comment period as we look to ensure and balance the ability to incorporate living shorelines as a measure in the resource protection areas, and again, consider the overall policy and intent of the CBPA, which is to protect water quality. And that is my overview of the current regulatory activity. As I mentioned, you can find information on the Virginia Town Hall, both specific to the proposed text, as well as the opportunity to provide comment.
Great. Justin, you get the award of spot on 10 minutes. My goodness. Very good. I don't see a question in the chat, a clarifying question. So I'm going to move on real quick to Randy Owen, who's the Deputy Chief of the Habitat Division at the Virginia Marine Resources Commission, to talk about some of the activities going on there with Living Shorelines. And then we'll circle back and have an open period for questions after Randy's presentation. Randy, take it away.
I'm sorry, Skip. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, is the presentation on the
Yes.
screen?
Yes, it is. You're good to go.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I had a little trouble with the mute button. Good morning, everyone. This will be a fairly quick presentation. As you all know, we've been working on updating our wetland guidelines in response to both the 2011 and the 2020 Living Shorelines legislation. Sorry, having trouble. There we go. In 2011, Senate Bill 964 and the resulting legislation established living shorelines as the preferred alternative for stabilizing tidal shorelines in the Commonwealth. In 2020, Senate Bill 776 and the resulting legislation requires the Marine Resources Commission to promulgate and periodically update its wetland guidelines to include minimum standards for the protection and conservation of wetlands, and to approve only living shoreline approaches to shorelines stabilization unless the best available science shows that such approaches are not suitable. To initiate our update of the guidelines, last year we contacted the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. They put together an interdisciplinary team of scientists to help guide us. Last fall, as many of you know, we held a series of workshops to gather public comment. We now have an internal update to our guidelines that we hope to post to the VMRC website March 1st for a comment period of about 30 days. Very importantly, any and all comments, please send them to wetlandguidelines@mrc.virginia.gov. We have a small staff. It's very important that we not miss anyone's comments. We need time, and we're expecting a pretty large response. So I have several people on my staff going to help me collate your comments, review your comments, and ready them for eventually the guideline, the updated guidelines to the commission. The schedule is tentative, but we would hope to go to the commission in April to request a public hearing. If we get there and they agree, then we would hope to hold the public hearing for the commission's consideration of the guidelines in May. So I guess in summary, we have an internal draft that we hope to post to our website around March 1st. We do have the email addresses of the workshop participants last fall. We'll add to that the local wetland board staffers, and it'll be on our website with a public notice. So, you know, we're looking for you to provide your comments. And again, hopefully request an April meeting, request a public hearing at the April commission meeting with a May commission meeting to consider it. Depending on the response, which may be fairly heavy, these timelines could shift. Skip, those are my comments.
Even more efficient. Thank you, Randy. Well, with that, we're going to open this up for questions. There were a few questions that were posted as we went along that that I took note of. So let me start with those. There was one question that was hold on here, that was posted by Amber Ellis about what the community flood preparedness program support would look like for riverine areas, and whether there are opportunities for this consortium to have a role in sort of doing outreach and helping the riverine localities understand it. And definitely, one of the things I was going to mention was I think that watershed groups like this, like Friends of the Rappahannock, like the Potomac Conservancy, those that reach into the riverine areas, I think have a real role in helping the localities in those areas that you serve, that you cover, help understand this. Because right now, a lot of the uphill localities are unaware of these programs. This is especially true in the South Side. The folks in the valley are a little more aware, but I think there is a real role to be played in doing outreach and then in helping these localities understand the priority that is placed on nature-based solutions and beginning to get some of the shoreline buffer work that your organizations do into the mix for project funding. So I would definitely pay attention to this, and I think there, like I said, there is a role for a number of these, for a number of the watershed groups to participate in this program. Kevin asked a question about whether there's a priority in the Community Flood Preparedness Fund to implement projects identified in the joint land use studies. These are studies that have done between the Department of Defense and surrounding localities to look at projects that will help the military facilities continue their or improve their operational readiness in the face of climate change and sea level rise. I expect that those studies will be included. We haven't seen the formal guidelines yet, or the grant manual that'll be coming out soon. But I expect that that'll be one of the sort of planning documents that the fund will use to help prioritize projects, but they'll also have to be in the application that's made by the local governments. So the local governments are going to have to also, I think, determine their priorities. And if those projects are in their priorities, then those would be submitted. But at this point, as I say, it's all sort of up in the air. The Technical Advisory Committee, which advises the fund in the coastal areas, is going to be meeting, I think, in about a week or so. And they're going to be setting some of these priorities as well. So that would be another place to have those joint land use studies included. There was a question asked whether the study is going to include future floodplain projections in conjunction with the work being done by VINS. This gets to the issue of if we just deal with currently flooding areas, we're not really going to keep ahead of the problem. There is going to be an emphasis in the Community Flood Preparedness Fund in addressing areas of future flooding. Although a state standard hasn't been set, a formal state standard hasn't been set for sea level rise projections going forward, it's generally accepted that it will be the NOAA intermediate high curve, which, as I recall, has an additional 1.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050 or 60, an additional 3 feet by roughly 2070, 2080. For the riverine areas, future floodplain work is a little further off because first we have to do the study showing or calibrating the new projections on rainfall intensity, flooding intensity, frequency, and duration. And from that, we'll have to do some modeling on where the future riverine floodplains are going to be. So, but the intention of this administration, as long as it's around for another year, is going to be to include those future flood plains in the fund. And I think that with a new administration coming in a year, thank you very much for the Constitution of Virginia that only allows us a one-term, 4-year governor. We're going to all of us on this call are going to have to be vigilant to make sure that in a subsequent administration that this focus on future flooding that this administration has undertaken is continued. Let's see here. What do we got here? We got one more. And Justin, this one's for you. A question about how will the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act provision to establish a riparian buffer where it does not exist, how will that be enforced going forward? And that was a question by Kevin Du Bois. So Justin, do you have can you step in on that one?
Sure. I don't think there's anything specific, related to what I spoke about with this. I mean, typically when you look at any of the provisions for the criteria or the requirements under the Bay program, those are enforced by virtue of our locality program reviews. So each locality implements the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act, and under a set schedule, typically around 5 years, we conduct a program review to look at the implementation of the provisions by that locality. And so that would be a time that we would look at both the general program elements related to ordinances and comprehensive plan requirements, as well as site plan reviews, where we'd look at items such as reestablishment of a vegetative buffer or other criteria requirements and how they're implemented by a locality. So that's how the enforcement of that would be handled under the proposed regulations. As I mentioned, there is a distinction between currently developed and undeveloped or naturally vegetative provisions. And part of that in the developed also includes recognition of existing intensely developed areas. So certainly if there's an interest in the overlay there in terms of the proposal with the establishment or reestablishment of a vegetative buffer, there is some potential impact both from the recognition of the distinction between current site conditions under the climate adaptation provisions, as well as I mentioned on the tree incorporation regulatory amendments, we did specifically recognize either the preservation or replanting of trees within existing provisions related to vegetation, which would include the reestablishment of a vegetative buffer.
Don't go anywhere, Justin. There's one more here. A question about whether there's any requirement for public participation, constituent participation at the locality level in the adoption of the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act provisions going forward. Are you aware of any provision for public input at the locality level, Justin?
So again, and my local government law experts could probably speak to this more, but the localities are required to implement the program. Under the program requirements, they are required to incorporate the criteria into their ordinances. And so there is a specific process that's required to be followed by localities when they are making those changes. They do, that process does typically incorporate public hearings, depending upon the changes and the process there. So there is that public engagement element specific to a localities program. In addition, as I mentioned, for example, at the higher level with the actual requirements, we are in a public comment process now as it relates to what the criteria and the requirements will be that the locality has to adopt and incorporate into their provisions. Additionally, for example, if there is an issue or concern at a locality level and a citizen reaches out as well, we do share that information with the locality and request for them to take a look at that and provide us additional information as well. So depending upon the element, but certainly in terms of how they incorporate it into their ordinance provisions, there is existing law and requirements around public participation for any ordinance provision changes, for example, and that would apply for any as a result of the CVPA requirements. And I think Heather's also helping me out answering some questions in the chat related there too, on being able to share some more on that on the public comment.
Great, thank you very much. There's a question for Randy, and at great risk to the progress of this webinar, I would ask that Jeff Corbin be unmuted, something that should only be done with great care. So Jeff, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, Skip. Thank you. The wetland guidance is coming out. Obviously, the statute changes last year that made living shoreline the default practice unless the best available science says it can't be done. That's a big deal. I mean, it's, you know, is it going to be easy to use best science to show you can't do it? Is it going to make it stringent? Are there going to be loopholes? And I know you probably can't say a lot, Randy, or maybe this is a question for VIMS as well, but are the guidelines going to be pretty prescriptive? I mean, is it going to be, you know, a yes/no checklist kind of thing that would qualify whether or not a living shoreline is doable or not doable? Or is it going to require a site assessment? I mean, is there anything you can say about, you know, what the format for proving best available science for or against is going to be?
Yes, I'll attempt to answer that now. There is in the current draft a definition that is proposed that includes as best available science the three programs at VIMS, the Office of Advisory Services, the CCRM's program, as well as the shoreline studies. C's comments are also considered, and anything that we would identify as emerging wetland science. But that will definitely be a topic for discussion, you know, in the final adoption of the guidelines. But right now, we you know, the Bureau of Marine Environmental Engineers go to the sites, they go to the wetland boards. We consider whether the wetland board administered the law as it has been passed, and if they have not, then we would recommend a review to the commissioner to review the board's decision. We're working. There are site conditions, obviously, that thwart living shorelines, and we are able to get guidance from VIMS on these cases, but there's SAV to contend with. We're seeing some really good projects for some living shorelines, but then they run into the SAV. We heard earlier about the substrate issues that can limit the offshore placement of a sill, as can the nearshore depths. So we will be addressing, and I would look forward to everyone's comments with respect to what they think best available science should be.
All right, there is a lot of good information in the chat about keeping up with this process. And so I think review that. We're approaching the end of our question and answer period, and I don't see a whole
Skip,
lot.
I have one more kind of question that was posed by a couple people, actually. First, Kevin was wondering if development of native wetland plant nurseries could be a way to solve plant availability and develop new tribe economic opportunity using the DEIJ strategy. And KJ Hengler also said that that's been something that he or she has recommended in terms of economic development. And is there a way that we could be, you know, considering that in the funding mechanisms, I believe, is what they're thinking about. Any thoughts on that?
Are you talking about the Community Flood Preparedness Fund?
I believe it was the Community Flood Preparedness Fund that they're talking about. Is can we use some of that funding for economic development to promote and support DEIJ efforts and provide sources of plant materials?
This is Kevin.
No way of knowing that. I think we're going to have to wait for the, I don't know whether that would be an eligible activity under the fund or not.
Yeah, that was not my question, Skip. It was more general than that. It was just not specifically for the community flood program, but just in general to promote living shorelines. It was mentioned that there's not enough plant material available. So I was just wondering in general if I know I've at other forums at William and Mary and stuff like that, where some of the tribes have spoken that they're looking to develop green economy opportunities. And it seems like building nurseries for native wetland plants would be a good fit for some of the tribes to engage in, but I think they would need some financial assistance to get up and running. And it would seem like that would be a great opportunity both for the local tribes and to implement DEIJ activities within the state of Virginia. Not necessarily the community flood preparedness grant program, but just in general.
Okay.
I brought that up in my presentation, and so I'll just mention that Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, VDACS, their Agriculture and Forestry Industries Development Fund. If you take a look at their website, I mean, that's what they're suggesting helps us with that WIP goal. I think the wording they've used, the availability of funds for projects involving operations such as nurseries to produce native plants. So yeah, I think tying in DEIJ goals, a conversation with VDACS by any interested party would be a good discussion. I put the link to that VDACS grant program in the chat. So,
okay. All right. I have put back into the chat the link to our website that hopefully will keep track of all of these changes going forward. So link to that. And with that, I will turn it back to the host.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Skip and Aaron, Randy, and Justin. When we were organizing this summit, we put out a survey asking about what people wanted to hear about, and the policy updates were a big part of the response to that. So our next thing is a break, but before we break, I just want to say that we are going to be doing our breakout sessions at 11 a.m. And so if you have not had a chance yet to look at the descriptions of those sessions, you might want to look over those. I sent them out in an email, but we can also enter them into the chat box now. And Ryan, if you want to maybe share the slide that has the names on it, that might be helpful for folks. But we're running about 5 minutes behind, so we'll push the break 5 minutes forward. So please rejoin us at 11:05.
Hey, Emily, this is Matt Zuby. Is there any way I can get into the Designing Effective Living Shorelines at 11 o'clock, please?
Yes, so the way that this should work is that when the breakout rooms open, you will be able to select which room you're interested in joining. So
awesome, thank you.
Sorry, Zoom only let me type certain number of words at a time. I copied and pasted, but it was like, you can't paste more. So all of them are in there, but you'll see some, it's kind of chunked a little weird for the session description. In the chat box.
Hi, I was in a breakout. This is Kelly Hingler. Sorry. I don't know why my Zoom comes up KJ Hingler, probably my email. the breakout that we had, I was speaking with someone about stakeholders here for a project. Do you know who she had on glasses? I can't seem to find her and the folks who were.
That was me, Christine.
Oh, hi, Christine.
Hi.
Could you send me to that phone number a text with your contact information?
Sure.
I would
Absolutely.
deeply appreciate it. Yeah, I'm going to be actually speaking to some of the stakeholders shortly. And actually texting back and forth with them on another matter. So I thought I would share that opportunity with them.
Okay. I am working on another project. It might not be till this afternoon, but I will do it today.
Oh, that's fine. Thank you. No pressure. Sorry about that.
All right.
All right, I'm going to go back mute. Thank you so much.
Diversity of topics, and I got a question from a couple of folks asking if they would be able to watch the recordings of the other sessions they weren't able to attend, and the answer is yes, very likely. We did record them, so I will package those recordings and send them out at some point in the next couple of weeks. I don't know how long it's going to take, but anyway, before we break for lunch, I did want to make a quick request of you guys. And Ryan, are you around? Or I can share my screen too. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, does everyone see that that slide? Yes, great. So before we break for lunch, we did want to take the opportunity to do a little bit of crowdsourcing. So we want to hear about living shoreline projects in the Lower James that are kind of on the horizon. So if you're interested in sharing that information, please drop that in the chat box. This could be a project that is already designed and shovel ready, or it could be a project that you're just thinking about and really haven't taken steps to start yet. So, you can include project details, the description of the project, what stage it's in, anything like that. And we will collect those and kind of circle back to them later on in the program. But unless there's anything I'm missing, I think we're ready to break for lunch. All right, well, the Zoom room will remain open, so we will come back at 12:45.
See you guys then.
Computer, please rejoin us. All right. Looks like people are filtering back. Thank you to everybody who shared one of their upcoming projects in the chat box. It's always interesting to hear what's going on in the watershed, and we're going to loop back to some of those a little bit later on in the day. But looks like we're getting most people back. Did anyone else eat lunch outside for the first time in like months? Because I did. Oh yeah, it looks like Katie's still outside.
I'm jealous.
All right. Well, I think we can go ahead and get back into the program. Yeah, so I'm gonna hand things over to Shireen Hughes for this section on living shoreline success stories and collaborations.
Welcome back, everybody. And if you weren't here earlier, I'm Shireen Hughes. I'm Assistant Director of Wetlands Watch, and I'm the Virginia Coordinator for the Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professional Program. And we have been a member of this Living Shoreline Collaborative for since the inception. And actually, one of our roles is to bring more people to the table, including the Chesapeake Bay certified Chesapeake Bay landscape professionals. So we're working on workforce development around living shorelines and other green infrastructure practices for more resilient landscapes and shorelines. So I'm happy to be here today, and I get to do the fun stuff. I get to share the success stories and collaborations and mentoring and all that's happened really since the last summit. And so I'm really excited to see this collaborative growing and new projects and new efforts arising from it. And I'm going to share some of those with you. This is such a great image from the Elizabeth River Project. And it kind of is a collaboration around living shorelines in a nutshell. You know, how would this get done if you didn't have a couple people who knew what they were doing guiding you, and a bunch of people working together to get the job done? Somebody provided the materials, somebody provided the design. It may have been all the same people, but it may not have been. It's each group or person is doing what they do best, and maybe they're funded to do or they're willing to volunteer to do, and all working together can meet our goals of living shorelines as tides rise through sea level rise, or just for in terms of tidal fluctuations on a daily basis. You've got to get the job done, and you have a deadline. We have the Tmdl deadlines, but we also have sea level rise deadlines that we're trying to meet. So there's also following me are going to be Barbara Gavin. She's going to share a video from Elizabeth River Project. Ryan Walsh will share a story about one of his projects that has been accomplished through the collaborative and the funding of the collaborative. Then Ryan will share a video that Wetlands Watch and Elizabeth River Project worked on. Then Trevor Wong will talk about a project that he's working on in James City County. And we'll finish with Justin and the city of Norfolk, where there's so many living shorelines going in. So, you know, you've heard about the living shoreline and the collaborative. It started with a smaller group of people, but that group has grown. Just, I think one of the outcomes of the last summit is it brought people together and raised awareness of these joint efforts and how we could work together. So, you know, we have the Elizabeth River Project and the James River Association looked for funding to fund their working together to Elizabeth River Project is actually mentoring and training Ryan and Emily and other staff. So they're sharing their experience, and then James River Association staff are helping them to meet their goals to get a project done. The other thing that's happened is both of those organizations, as well as Jim Cahoon at Bay Environmental, have basically said, look, we don't have enough contractors out there doing the work. We need more people trained. We'll hire subcontractors to do the work, and we'll train them as they do it. So there's new shoreline contractors that are getting trained to do living shorelines, and Jim Cahoon, Bay Environmental, wants to train CBLPs to be subcontractors for him on his jobs, because it's a more cost-effective way of him dealing with the installation. They also joined forces to develop the funding to fund new Living Shoreline projects. The other thing that came out of it is, and I will brag about this, we invited some CBLPs to the last summit, and Robin Woolsey was one of them with the Colonial Soil and Water Conservation District. She reached out to me afterwards and said, we want to get involved. How can we get involved? We pulled together the collaborative group, and they joined forces and said, okay, we can mentor James River Association staff and Soil and Water Conservation District staff and DCRC's program, and Karen with Aaron and Karen During said, we'll mentor and train them in the field to do site inspections and evaluations. And now I see that Karen During is also working with the Master Gardeners to develop a program similar to Master Gardener program in the Northern Neck that's been very, very impactful. Also, Wetlands Watch has brought our funding for our RISE funding to the table, and we ran a level 1 training in Hampton. And we're doing videos and developing workshops and other trainings. And we're trying to actually develop a module for one of our programs called CBLP Associate. And that's for youth training. So we're trying to develop a Living Shoreline module for that as well with the Elizabeth River Project. Also, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation joined us, and they've been heavy hitters in the world of living shorelines for a long time. And they saw that there was a need for a listserv, and they pulled it all together, and it's just amazing. And so I'll show you those resources in a minute. And then the City of Norfolk joined us as well. And so we're really happy to see how we can all work together and look for more people to join our collaborative. This is an outcome, resources. The James River Association developed this Living Shoreline website for our initiative. The Center for Coastal Resource Management updated their shoreline management handbook. It's an amazing resource, and I put all these links in the chat section. And then the Chesapeake Bay Foundation developed this Living Shoreline website, and they're all just really informative and integrated. So they work together. Wetlands Watch and the Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professional Program are working on the Living Shoreline pilots. We're doing that Living Shoreline module for youth training, and we're doing that with the Elizabeth River Project at Paradise Creek, or anywhere that Elizabeth River Project works. And then we've also been using our funding and our resources to work with JRA and ERP to developing these videos, informative videos. And as you can see, actually, CBLP and Wetlands Watch, it's all part of another collaborative, basically, where we join forces with a lot of other groups. And you'll see that a lot of these groups that are in our collaborative have done this kind of thing in their own area. And this collaborative just brings us all together and aligns us across the watershed and across the region. I think that this is just a great example. It was a graphic that we used for the upcoming NIFWIF grant that's funding the expansion and maturation of the collaborative, as well as our training and monitoring work and implementation. But you can see the arrows go back and forth. It just basically shows that we're working together, we're sharing information, we're sharing resources, we're sharing knowledge. And that's what has to happen. Is this just too big of an issue to try and do it alone? So I will stop sharing, and if I forgot any projects, I apologize. Please add them in the chat, and we'll keep moving forward. And as each of the speakers presents their little video or their presentation, just introduce yourself. And then also, if you benefited from some kind of collaborative experience, it could just be that you have been mentored by somebody else and that brought you to where you are today. You could share that with the group because I think that's important for everybody to understand.
So I think first on the list, Barbara, if you wouldn't mind introducing the video, and I believe after that, Ryan is gonna share that on his screen.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. So while Ryan gets that pulled up, just so you guys know, the site you're all about to see really highlights the partnerships that Shireen was just talking about that are involved in creating these projects. The property owner reached out to the city of Norfolk for guidance, who then sent it over to me at Elizabeth River Project. Turns out Tom, the homeowner that you see, and I are from the same town. His brother is friends with my dad, and he sold me my current car. So I think you'll get the vibe from the video that we created a real friendship since then. He just called me an hour ago during this this summit. So with that, we kept going. You know, we worked with then Jim Cahoon at Bay Environmental to create the design and do the install. And then we also came back in a year later. So this was a phased project. The first step was doing the living shoreline, and then we came in to design and install his riparian buffer planting. So that's what you'll see.
Hey guys, I'm Tom Ivy. This is my place back here behind us. Barbara and the Elizabeth River Project, we've been together now for 2.5 years, almost 3 years. You know, talk a little bit about the project, I guess. It was a wonderful project. I actually sent Barbara yesterday some before pictures and after pictures. When I first looked at this property, I've got good vision, I feel like, but I didn't have enough vision to be able to see for it to turn out like it did now. There was cinder block, there was roadway, there were tires. I mean, everything imaginable had just been thrown. It was a junkyard. I mean, it really truly was. These guys came in, they cleaned it up, they you know, helped support me, and I was clueless. I've never lived on the river before, and I don't know what made me want to live on the river, but I finally decided I want to live on the river. But they came in and really walked me through everything. I mean, from the permitting process to help me find a person that could, you know, help arrange to the permits for the pier, for the floating dock. They've been there every step of the way. And for me, not being an environmentalist, but enjoying wildlife, enjoying hunting and fishing, obviously, you know, for me, it was about bringing the water quality back. For a homeowner, it was a blessing. I mean, it really and truly was. I couldn't have done it on my own. There's no way I could have had the vision that these guys have had, the monetary support out of it, but they didn't have to persuade me to do this. I would have been more than happy to do this, you know, with it, because it has been such a good project.
Yeah.
So what's so great about this was it was a testimonial, and that was something that we heard was missing, is we needed more testimonials, more positive stories about living shorelines. And so we were able to pull everybody together, and ERP was amazing. They gave us their staff for a whole day, and we, you know, ran around and took little videos and pulled them all together. So really excited to see that. And Ryan Walsh from JRA is going to share his experience.
Okay, so I'm going to show a video of the construction of one of our very first demonstration living shorelines projects. This was built this past summer down in Isle of Wight on a piece of private property. This is a grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And speaking of collaboratives, I mean, part of this grant was able to fund this Living Shoreline Collaborative. But just selecting the specific project, we could not have done this alone. We had help from VIMS, from Wetlands Watch, from Bay Environmental Inc., from DCRCs, from different localities, and probably a whole bunch of people that I'm forgetting the name off the top of my head right now. But I just filmed a short video of the actual construction process. And if you're unfamiliar with Living Shorelines, I can just sort of walk over what's happening through each step of the video. It's not overly long. So let me go ahead and pull this up. Okay, so this is Brewers Creek in Isle of Wight County. These marshes are actually directly across from the piece of private property. You can see they're really lush, and it's all nice, natural, native vegetation. Wildlife you can find in this marsh include muskrats and diamondback terrapins, and quite a few of them. So here's the actual site. You can see some undercut bank erosion. The slope is starting to fill, and they're losing about a foot or two of sediment each year. And the first thing we did is we put in a coconut fiber core log, or I should say Bay Environmental Inc. did. And that's going to hold in the sand that's put in place. You can see that a plywood makeshift road was made so they could wheelbarrow it down one load at a time. And here's Jim properly grading it as it comes in. And this took several days. I think it took all of 3 days for all the sand to be brought down. You can also see that work needs to be completed at low tide. Here are the homeowners checking on the progress. And the sand had to settle for 2 weeks before more was brought in. The sand was actually a little bit coarser than the previous kind that was brought in. There we go. And here are the oyster shell bags that are put in place. These are put in front of the coconut fiber logs. These help from erosion, and eventually they'll be encrusted with a biological veneer. And juvenile oysters, also known as spat, will be able to run them. And then here we are, JRA staff are actually planting. It was pretty hot that day. It was in the 90s. And so this is native Spartina alterniflora, or smooth cord grass that's going in. And then the last step is to put up goose exclusionary fencing, so you don't have Canada geese immediately swoop in and eat your brand new project. There we go. And that's it.
Thank you, Brian.
The homeowners were really pleased with the project. We recently just went back out there and added a few more oyster shell bags at their request, but yeah.
So the next video is a series of videos that we're putting together that we would like to use for training purposes. And this is the first one that we produced, and will be, we filmed three different kinds of living shoreline projects that the Elizabeth River Project had worked on in Norfolk. And we're kind of going through talking about the whole process, from how did you hear about the site in the first place to permitting, et cetera, for each site. So here you go.
Standing here in a homeowner's backyard. This is a project that was completed about a year ago to date. And this homeowner came to us, actually live across the creek from him. And he came to me asking if there's anything that he could do for his shoreline because he he had a bulkhead, which is a vertical structure that was collapsing. It was built in the 1950s. And he went to get his wetlands permit to put in a new one. And he was told that he needed to put in a living shoreline instead. And so he was looking for a contractor to do the design and also the construction. And he called me up and asked if we could help. And we have a cost share program, which we were able to cost share this project 50% of the total project cost. This is a more soft approach. So we use core logs and backfilled it with sand. We did a little bit of upper bank grading, but pretty straightforward and with the project. And as you can see, it's doing very well. It's only been a year out, and the Spartina is already taller than I am. Elizabeth River project, our staff designed the project and then permitted it, and then we actually ended up coming in and building this particular project.
This project required the completion of a joint permit application, and the joint permit application had a review from the VMRC, the local wetlands board, which is Norfolk, and the Corps of Engineers. And it resulted in a permit that was a joint permit from the local wetlands board as well as the VMRC for what we call our expedited living shoreline permit, and from the Corps. And it took about a month and a half. This project also required a review of the regulatory agencies for the pier that we're standing on. That was something that was included in the entire joint permit application. It's reviewed separately, but everything can be turned in the same application. And then there were a few trees in the area where you see the grass now, and those trees required a permit from the city in order to remove them. They also had to be mitigated for as a result of removing them.
Materials that we use, since this was a softer approach, we use the 16-inch core logs. If you actually look behind you, there's a 16-inch core log over there that can be seen. Then we also used jute mesh to lay out on top of everything, tons and tons and tons of sand, and all of these native marsh grasses, lower marsh grass here, Spartina alterniflora, and then more high variety Spartina patens. First thing we had to do, since there was still old bulkhead material in the lower mud part and the lower mud flat area here, we needed to use a 16-ton excavator to get that material out and then transport it to a dumpster with a skid steer. The dumpster would have been placed on top over there at that time. And then from there, we would then install the core logs, staking them down with wooden stakes and then tying them down so they won't float off. And then after that, we would start the process of unloading tons and tons and tons of sand with the excavator to fill in the area, to bring the sand up to height with the core log there, and then lay out jute mesh, because with this shoreline here, because they have a pretty decent slope from the top of the yard down to their bank, we would have a lot of sheet flow with rainfall, so we would need something to help break up that water energy as all the runoff from any kind of large rainstorm be flowing down, so we wouldn't have any plants popping up and floating off. And then once all this was done, this isn't here now because this is grown in so well, we had Goose exclusionary fencing around the perimeter help prevent geese and ducks from flying in and being able to eat at the immature plants, because at the time we get the plugs at about 1 to 2 inch size, and it takes about a year or two for them to grow to this kind of size. I believe this did take 2 to 3 weeks, mainly because we did have some scares with a hurricane around that time period, and then we also had a couple of rainstorm events, so we needed to touch up on the sand in order to be sure that the project would be an overall success down the road.
The most important thing for homeowners to think about is when their goose fencing is up is maintaining it. So when these fresh plants are babies and they're just plugs, it's really easy for curious waterfowl to get in and pull those up. So making sure that the goose fencing is maintaining itself. We also put string across the top with fluorescent flagging so that they don't use it as a landing zone. So making sure that that's in place, as well as keeping an eye on the rack line that builds up. So when we do get high tide events or flooding events, keeping an eye on the amount of material that floats in and can smother the marsh. So whether that's pine straw, boards, the random things that can float through an urban river, keeping those things in check. Also looking at plugs that might have been popped up if they weren't put in well enough. So a good sporty homeowner can come out and do that themselves. They can also tell a contractor that they've lost plants. They could also tell us. So for a site like this in particular, this homeowner was able to keep a good eye on their plants. Their plants have also grown in really well. These have been in for about a year now. And with that, they were able to go ahead and remove their goose fencing. One of the last things that we want to do is keep goose fencing up for a full 2 years, say, and the plants grow in so well that you actually damage plants when you're trying to remove the fencing. So that's why this came out early. The other thing is, at a site like this where he does have such a significant slope coming down, we planted in jute mesh, as Ian mentioned, but with that, we want to make sure that this bare area behind the patons does get populated. So whether that's patons that grow in as well, whether it's turf grass, making sure that something gets in so that we don't just have that loose sediment available.
Would that bare area be a good place for some conservation landscaping using native plants, creating a little bit more of a buffer between the turf and the living shoreline?
Yes, it would. So a riparian buffer planting is something we suggest to almost all of our homeowners if they have a potential opportunity for a wetland to migrate directly into their property to continue protecting it. So this area is partial shade, has brackish water. So planting with natives that are inclined to be in those situations and in those conditions, you could plant dozens of species in a place like this.
I noticed that some of the plants that are occurring naturally on one side of the property are starting to show up on the other side, naturally regenerate on the other side of the property. Could you talk about that a little bit?
I could. So they have some marsh fleabane, this lovely pink flower on this side, and there's a couple of little ones popping up within the new marsh. This was already here when we came to build the project. It was about the only plant that was existing behind this failing bulkhead. So those came out when the sand was put in and when the coral logs were put in, so they are starting to regenerate. Marsh fleabane naturally seeds very well, so that's something that can also fill in around. The other thing is, on either side, they have one neighbor that has significant saltbush, and on the other, sinusoides. So our hope is that with all of these surrounding natives, they won't have to deal with potential invasive species as well.
Okay, next up, we have Trevor Wong from James City County. And I would just say that I live in James City County, and I know that the first living shoreline in James City County was a CBF Voices project. And she is now working for, Ann Jerzyk is now working for CBF, and she's a level 2 CBLP. So I like to toot her horn. Trevor, if you could introduce yourself and go along, that'd be great.
All right. Hey guys, how are you? I'm Trevor Wong. See if I can get this
Everybody see the presentation?
Not at the moment. Do you have it on 2 screens? Or is it all on one?
How about now?
No. Did you click to share your screen?
I did.
There we go.
All right. You guys can see better now? Very good. Sorry about that. All right. I'm Trevor Wong, work with James City County Stormwater and Resource Protection. I'm a watershed planner here. So thank you guys for having me. Here to talk about briefly talk about a living shoreline restoration project that we have ongoing at the Chickahominy Riverfront Park. So a little bit about the park. It's located in the western portion of our county. This black line in the middle of your screen indicates the county divide. So on the left-hand side of the park is the Chickahominy River, and on the upper portion of the park runs Gordon's Creek, tributary to the Chickahominy River, which all leads down to the James. So the Chickahominy Riverfront Park is a recreational park owned and operated by the county. Its primary uses are primitive campsites, which border the Chickahominy River. There are some RV camping sites along the Gordon Creek side, and then recreational activities scattered throughout. So our department worked alongside a company called Stantec to develop a living shoreline technique and approach. And we partnered with, or actually we received funding from the VEE in order to make this project happen. So some site conditions along this park, especially along the Chickahominy River, they experienced severe erosion that started occurring along the bluffs, nearly 3 to 5 foot vertical banks with sloughing erosion occurring, which is not only a water quality issue for us, but also a safety issue given the proximity of the primitive campsites to these bluffs. So it's becoming a safety issue as well. So a description of the project, again, the body of water towards the top is Gordon's Creek, surrounding it the Chickahominy River. So this project was broken up into 4 segments. Along the Chickahominy River, that would be segment A. And then on Gordon's Creek, there are 3 separate segmented projects out. But we'll start with the Chickahominy River. So in segment A, there was approximately 1,180 linear feet of shoreline restoration throughout this portion of the project, including the installation of 930 linear feet of rock sills, beach nourishment, and some marsh plantings, all leading to 0.17 acres of marsh creation and 0.15 acres of beach enhancement. The area to be planted behind the rock sills and in the marsh area is likely going to have pickerelweed, arum, species like lizardtail and stem bulrush all sprouting throughout it for this marsh creation. Moving upwards, segment B along Gordon's Creek. This area is encompassed and will have approximately 516 linear feet of rock sills associated with it, about 0.1 acres of marsh enhancement, and bank grading at a 2-to-1 slope. This bank grading will be planted with a riparian, native riparian seed mixture. Segment C is right on the corner of both the Chickahominy River and Gordon's Creek, so right at that bend. That area has approximately 267 linear feet of coir log installations. and immediately seaward of the existing marsh, 0.1 acres of marsh enhancement behind it, again, to be planted with a lot of those same species that we discussed earlier on the Chickahominy River. And finally, segment D has approximately 162 linear feet of rock revetment and a bank grading at 2-to-1 slope and quarter matting with, again, native buffer seeding mix to stabilize that bank. So a couple pictures from before, actually, I'm sorry, along the Chickahominy River side of this project, a short little diagram showing some of the proposed bank grading that will occur. The rock sills that have been placed out to create the marsh, the sandy beach area that we're bringing in, some breakwaters, and the proposed marsh enhancement portions outlined here in green. So that's kind of an overview on the Chickahominy side. On the Gordons Creek side, very similar. Again, we have our marsh enhancement here highlighted in green. The proposed bank grading at 2-to-1 with native riparian seed mixtures to be planted inside. The rock sills that are encompassing the shoreline, and our quarter log marsh toe sill that we have proposed down near the bottom. So now we get some before pictures. This is Gordons Creek. Doesn't look too bad at the moment. Out here is the Chickahominy River. Like I said, it doesn't look too bad until you start getting up into it. So approximately 3 to 5 feet, varying throughout this area. As you can see, it gets pretty steep in certain areas of this project. This is all along Gordons Creek. We then move over to the Chickahominy River side. This area here is all of the primitive camping sites. So as you can see, the erosion is indeed starting to encroach into that area pretty heavily and sloughing off a significant amount of sediment into the Chickahominy River and Gordons Creek tributaries. So that's probably the most significant portion of erosion occurring in this area here. I'm standing down near the water, looking back up towards the primitive campsites. But it goes well overhead in some areas and certainly needed some kind of restoration project to happen. So again, this project is ongoing. So this is Gordons Creek now. The photos before were taken approximately 2 years ago, and we are in the process of the construction phases along Gordons Creek and Chickahominy River currently. So you can see the rock sills that have been placed, the bank grading that has been done so far, and the quarter matting, and we're now getting some stabilization, which will then be replaced with a native riparian seed mixture in the future. This area yet to be planted, but again, some rock sills here with quarter logs to be placed in the background of that photo. The Chickahominy Riverside portion of this project with some breakwaters and then some beach enhancement. This area will all be planted with marsh grasses. Looking out towards the Chickahominy River, the James is actually just beyond that bridge. So you get a good snapshot of the breakwater system. In conclusion, basically this project is anticipated to reduce a significant amount of both sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus. So while it's not complete at the moment, 90 tons per year of sediment are anticipated to be reduced, 200 pounds per year of nitrogen, and 100 pounds per year of phosphorus through this project. So a lot of minimization efforts were also in place in order to reduce the amount of SAV impacts to this site. So original design would have incorporated about 31,363 square feet of SAV impacts. Due to the reduction of height on a lot of the sills and breakwaters going from 5 feet to approximately 3 feet above mean low water, we were able to minimize SAV impacts to 6,346 square feet, so about an 80% reduction in SAV impacts. There were approximately 0.02 acres of unavoidable vegetated wetland impacts. However, 0.37 acres of tidal marsh enhancement nearly doubled the approximated vegetated wetland loss. So we counted that for a win. So yeah, we worked with a couple different people on this project, collaborated with VIMS, VMRC, Army Corps of Engineers, and were able to come up with what we felt was the best solution to the erosion that was occurring on the Chickahominy Riverfront part. And we're looking forward to seeing how it plays out. So thank you very much for your time, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, Trevor. And we'll save questions till the end. We have set aside some time for questions, and I'm reading the comments on the side. So next up is Justin Shafer, and Justin Shafer is the organizer of a pretty amazing collaborative in Norfolk that Wetlands Watch, Elizabeth River Project, CBF, a lot of local agencies are part of. It's called the Watershed Task Force. And I was able to bring the existence of this collaborative to the Watershed Task Force and then invite them to participate and join in. So we're really happy that Norfolk has joined our steering committee because they have a lot of experience. And Justin was just telling me the other day how he has been the recipient of so much mentoring. Kevin Du Bois was mentioned in particular. So I just wanted to let Kevin know he got a shout out.
Thanks, Shireen. Y'all hear me and see my screen okay?
Yep.
All right. But yeah, again, Justin Shafer. So yeah, I've worked with, for the last decade or so with the city's Department of Public Works and our stormwater management program. My focus has been primarily on water quality, expanding into green infrastructure, and now a bit into resilience and flood reduction and all the many challenges that Norfolk is facing as a city. Coming in, I had a strong interest in wetlands. I had worked in them both in academia, studying them, the ecology of them, and doing some volunteer work and some permitting work before I got here. But I did learn a lot early on from Kevin and from others who Walter Priest, other members of the community, and then started getting involved with a lot of these community groups. And a big part of what I want to talk about today is how the shoreline restoration in the Lafayette over the last couple of decades has been not just a city effort, but a real strong community effort, and it would not have happened without all players being involved. So with that, just to make everybody familiar, the Lafayette River is a large watershed, eats up a good 40% of the city at least, primarily residential, over 80%. It's completely contained within the city, about over 50 miles of shoreline. And so you can see there's a mixture of a lot of residential with some commercial, industrial districts, some parks and schools, things like that. So a good mixed use watershed. With those sort of land uses, of course, in an old city come a lot of problems of water quality, habitat loss, aging infrastructure, improper infrastructure in the first place that we've now realized. So those are the sort of reasons why we started many years ago looking at what needed to be done with the shorelines along the Lafayette and elsewhere in Norfolk. So of course, on the right there used to be a bulkhead there at some point, but it's gone.
Justin, you're not advancing, I don't think.
Let's see. I'm going to.
You're still on your title slide.
All right, let me try changing my sharing.
Okay.
All right, what do you all see now?
Now we see the presenter's view. So we see this slide on one side.
I may have to go with that. Let me see if I can get my screen shared.
If you go down to
All
the
right.
circle with the 3 dots in it, it'll change
Okay.
out.
It's advancing now. So we're on the Lafayette River watershed slide.
Okay. And you're seeing the full slide view now, right?
Yep, we're seeing the full slide.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that, guys. All right. That's what I get for having too many monitors on my desk. So, like I was saying, so lots of failing infrastructure. You know, looks like they've tried to pour concrete behind that. So in essence, just destroyed the wetland. Same thing on the left. You know, they were probably trying to fix an old failed bulkhead there, and just started dumping rubble whenever they could find it. Or maybe they just needed somewhere to dump the rubble, which was frequently the case as well. But instead of putting it offshore, which we would do nowadays, they unfortunately dumped it right on the wetland. So we see this on a lot of places. You know, people want to recreate on the river. And if you don't give the fishermen somewhere to go, they're going to trample through your wetlands to get to the water to fish, which was the case here. And then you can see behind that, in trying to keep the site tidy back by the cones, we were mowing right up to the edge of the wetland, or probably into the wetland, causing erosion of the bank, just leading to pretty much a disaster of a site. It's probably one of the worst pictures I could find of a wetland site in Norfolk, and the docks failing in the background. So all sorts of problems. The site looks much better these days. And then even in our less developed areas, we have the normal problems of shading of wetlands, of sea level rise causing slow retreat of the front side of the wetlands. You know, small boat wake just slowly eating away at the front edge. So these sort of problems throughout the watershed, even in the more confined creeks. So with all that in mind, when we had these problems, there was a lot of interest early on from groups in creating more habitat. And then in water quality, we knew the wetlands helped with water quality, so that was a benefit. And then things like Chesapeake Bay Tmdl came along, and the city saw the opportunity to start getting some credit for water quality. So it just sort of kept building and building until modern days. Now we're also looking at it from a resilience component. So all these things add together to create the need and the desire to restore wetlands. And there's been a lot scattered throughout the watershed here. Nearly 4 miles have been restored over the last 2 decades, and that does not count the residential properties that groups like Elizabeth River Project have restored. And one of these days, maybe Barbara can magically pull that number up and put it in the chat box for us. But you know, maybe another mile or 2 of residential property throughout those years. So seeing a lot of good restoration. So I want to highlight for the rest of the slideshow some of the capital projects from the city first, and then get into a few of the community projects and how they're beneficial to us. Ooh, that picture on the top is a little fuzzy. One of these days I'm going to get the original from Kevin. But Collie Bay was one of our earliest living shorelines, the first large-scale shoreline the city worked on in the Lafayette River. And this project really highlighted early on how the community and the city and grantors can come together to really change a small watershed. So this small embayment, really just rock strewn, very little marsh left. And after many years now, it looks great out there. It continues to do great. We have some phragmites, of course, that we periodically work on, but it built on community interest and small community projects. And eventually, even a large apartment complex that was built in the bay ended up restoring a shoreline. Now, maybe it was a little bit of arm twisting. I'm not sure the full history of that one. But again, it shows that if you start the work in some of these areas, it really can expand into adjacent properties, big and small. Just moving through, lots of projects around the city in different creeks, different parts of the Lafayette. This one here is particularly interesting. It's what we call daylighting of creeks. So taking an area that used to be a creek that we filled in a long time ago, and that is very muddy, this river slowly trying to reclaim it, and nobody can use it for anything. So why not just go ahead and return it to the river? And so in this case, we just excavated out a wetland. In other cases, we've taken these areas and turned them into tidally influenced stormwater ponds to get some additional credit in that way towards water quality goals. There are lots of creative ways to restore wetlands around the river. Trying to fix these areas with this infrastructure that's just in horrible shape. The city was fortunate a few years back to receive a large grant from National Fish and Wildlife after Hurricane Sandy. And we've been moving through implementing projects off of that grant, just wrapping up here in the last year or so. But it was a good way to really tackle some of these long stretches of shorelines throughout the river, and in really the neighborhoods that hadn't thought about their shorelines much in a long time. They were just kind of wastelands. They couldn't even see the water in some cases. There was so much litter and debris that didn't go near it. So it provided an opportunity to do some good outreach in some neighborhoods that otherwise may not have ever gotten involved in this sort of work. And it wasn't just the city. You know, Old Dominion, a number of years back, created this gorgeous wetland out off the sailing center near the mouth of the river. Obviously, some bigger rock there with the fetch coming out near the mouth, but lots of good public community partners on this. And then shifting into our sort of nonprofit and community partners, and this is where you really start to get the benefit of bringing in all parts of the watershed, all parts of the community. Because these groups, while they're not focusing on these big, huge projects most of the time, I've been on a few where we wheelbarrowed sand for days and days, so we can do some big ones still. But these small projects are equally important because they're really spreading the work into the small corners of the watershed. They're reaching into these neighborhoods. The eroding end of a road that's 20 foot long is no less important than a long shoreline, somewhere else in the watershed. So we want to focus on all these little areas, and our community partners are great for doing that sort of work. They can mobilize quickly. They can get in a little more nimbly into these locations without destroying the existing habitat. And so they're really set up well for this type of work. And that in turn generates this community interest. And then that leads to the support of our elected officials, of our grantors, and these folks that are really important for sustaining this sort of work long term. There's no guarantee that the handful of staff in any given city or county that promote this sort of work are going to be there long term. And so it's good to get elected officials thinking about, hey, this is important. Our residents like this sort of work. We need to do this for a variety of reasons. And so, again, the community groups help with establishing that sort of mindset. They help to build capacity. Groups like the Lafayette Wetlands Partnership, make it their goal to develop new leaders in the community. They will not take on a project unless there are a community leader or two that are willing to essentially work with them to develop the entire project, to gather the volunteers, the tools, design it, permit it. And in doing so, they create not only a bigger volunteer base, but a leadership base. And that's important for, again, sustaining momentum in this sort of work. As one person maybe moves away or gets burnt out for a while or has other things take over, somebody else can step into a role and keep the work going. Also finding other ways to interact with projects that have been completed. Once the project's finished, the hands-on digging monkey part may be done, but that doesn't mean there's not more work to be done or nothing else interesting you can do with a project. Some people may not care about hauling around sand and rocks all day long. Maybe they are more interested in birds and bees. So things like BioBlitzes, getting people out, looking at the marsh, thinking about how it changes over time, how the ecology and biology of it changes. These interactive river posts that our friends at Eyes on the River installed, where folks who are out just biking or walking may notice them, can go up and read about it and then take a picture and upload it on Facebook. It just creates a documentation through time of what's going on in and around some of these sites. And probably most important from the community partnership perspective is the ability to assist with monitoring and maintenance. These are aspects that a lot of times our grantors do not support. They are not putting money in for after construction is finished, going out and continuing to keep the project up or even to monitor it past the first year or so. City budgets being what they are, sometimes the budget's not there to do much maintenance, or it's hard to budget it in because we're not sure what's going to be needed at any given time. So having groups that are willing and able to go out, keep an eye on these locations, periodically go out once a year, just take a look at what's going on, if there's any major erosion, any replanting that needs to be done, if there's more phragmites moving in, encroaching into the area that we want to maintain for a view shed. It helps keep the sites healthy, and it helps keep interest in maybe even expanding them. Maybe we want to tackle that extra 50 feet that we didn't do the first time around because there were huge pieces of rock. Well, I don't know how the partnership got those huge pieces of rock on the bottom left there out, but they found a way with wheelbarrows and brute force to do it sometime this summer. And so these groups really can make a difference on these projects, both big and small, short-term and long-term. through the partnerships that are developed. And so just showing off some of their hard work. This site used to be Phragmites, 10 foot tall, couldn't see anything. There's a little tiny patch left back there we need to still take out. But for the most part, it's clear. You can see out to the water from the back of a park. Really great opportunity again to engage a different neighborhood. Same thing here, an area that the neighborhood, that a walkway that folks like to walk along in the back of their neighborhood, but they couldn't see the water. The water was there, but they couldn't see it because of Phragmites. So coming in, removing that, replanting the marsh, putting in some interesting wildflower species, just that for visual interest, get people engaged. Our outfalls, like a lot of urban areas, these can just really be blighted areas, but with some hard work and perseverance, you can really beautify them, turn them into an asset to the community. And not just thinking about the wetlands themselves, but what's going on around them. We've heard a lot about oysters, and in the Lafayette in particular, oysters have been a huge success story. That was the first tributary to be fully restored per Bay Program's goals for oysters. So here, years ago, ERP and CDF worked on this oyster reef offshore of this existing wetland. Lafayette Wetlands Partnership came in behind and restored some eroding areas and some buffers further back behind these live oaks. So now the city is going to tackle the two corners by the bridges where there's steep erosion the volunteers can't handle. So just shows a great way to partner to get gorgeous projects completed. Just because there's a bulkhead, maybe we're not going to get rid of that seawall. It looks pretty intact, but it doesn't mean that we cannot restore wetlands behind it. These areas are flooded regularly. Transition from wetlands into buffer species just creates, again, a great asset for the community in a space that was otherwise just mud. And it's not just the bigger organizations, but it's just generating interest among smaller groups. So this was an area where there was the Eagle Scout looking for a project, and he said, "Hey, I've been hearing about these living shoreline things in one of my classes at school, and I really want to try to do one." So we found a spot that had some die off from an existing previous project, and we worked with them to restabilize it, get some planting in, and here are the guys back about a year later taking a look at their work, and it really grew in nicely. So it's just it's building the base amongst the existing organizations and the community as a whole. And I think just to wrap up with one final project here, the Hermitage Museum really exemplifies, what long-term commitment to a site can result in. The Hermitage is a great site near the mouth of the Lafayette River. It's obviously a private property, so there's a lot of potential on these sort of properties around the river. This site, they have a great conserved open space inside their gardens. They have some conservatories, but their shorelines were in horrible shape. There had been history of dredging many, many years ago and just continuing erosion, and they were starting to lose some historical structures. So groups like, starting back in the mid-2000s, groups like Chesapeake Bay Foundation, ERP, NOAA, Lafayette Wetlands Partnership, just project by project started working around the Hermitage to restore their shoreline. Adding in small sill features, adding in oyster reef balls offshore, planting, backfilling with sand, small section by small section, and then replanting. And then the staff of the Hermitage is using their own volunteer base to continue to expand on this, to maintain it, and really just to add features that highlighted their shoreline rather than just their interior gardens. And that has led to eventually the city, when we received our large NIFWIC grant, saying, "Hey, we have a good partner at the Hermitage and we have good community support. So we feel comfortable putting some city acquired grant funds towards this private property that's a public asset, and being able to finish off large sections on either side of the Hermitage with shoreline that are starting to look good out there." And so the long-term goal is, we want to make sure we can restore as many of our eroding properties as possible, both the residential side through efforts like River Star Homes, through our open spaces. The city can establish our small little pockets. Groups like Lafayette Wetlands Partnership want to tackle putting our oyster reefs offshore with groups like CDF, and then finding these private properties and working with them to kind of finish things off. Finding folks that are willing and showing them examples, places where this can work through the combined efforts of different parts of the community. So with that, I think we're heading towards the question section, but again, just highlighting all the partners.
Thank Thank you, Justin. And I like the point that you made about connecting and expanding upon one small project to connect the whole shoreline. Because I think that that's really important for us to think about, is rather than, you know, little isolated projects, can you grow a bigger expanded living shoreline from one project and build on it. So that was a great job. And obviously, as we said before, Norfolk has a lot of living shorelines. And so he had a lot of great projects to show. And it's a great, it shows you how collaboration can really make a big impact. So I think that's great. I know we're over our time and we're in the little short stretch break, and I would just say to everybody, you can just stand up and stretch right where you are and still listen. There were several questions about where people could get access to the videos. So maybe on the Living Shoreline Collaborative website, we could show these, we could have these videos as a link. Yay, Mary, keep going, stretch. Barbara, if you could share the information about the cost of the permitting process or the permit that you shared with Scotty, that would be great. And let's see, for Trevor, Lori Fox wanted to know how long it would take to establish the seed mix that you're using in the buffer. You still there?
You guys want me to go first?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. The seed mix should not take terribly long. Right now, the grass is there to stabilize the existing bank since it's been regraded. But it shouldn't take more than about 2-ish months once that gets planted, I would say, to fully kind of stabilize and establish itself. And then from there, it's basically just a self reclamating process. There won't be any maintenance really needed there, and it'll just take over and go with its natural process. So I would say that by summertime, I believe it's supposed to be planted around the April-ish time frame, and by late May, early June, you should see some significant results there. So
great. And also, Trevor, Rachel Peabody from Elizabeth River Project want to know where you sourced your riparian mix from.
That I don't know. I'm actually not sure if it has been sourced yet since it's ongoing. But if that is a question, I could find out the answer from contractors and people like that, and then get back in contact with you.
Okay. And one other person wanted to know, Andrea from the Mariners Museum wanted to know where she could sign up to get involved in the volunteer opportunities. And
oh, perfect.
So
yeah,
that's great.
You can. My email is at the end of the slides, but it's also a pretty easy one to remember. It's trevor.long, L-O-N-G, at jamescitycountyva.gov. I'd be happy to stick it in the chat, but you can email me and I'll put you on a server list with any upcoming educational opportunities coming out. So.
Okay, so whoever wants volunteers, put your email in the chat box so they know who to contact. Let's see. Oh, Scotty Dilworth asks, are there current cost share programs that the residents can apply for? And yes. And what I would say, I think that there's a summary of the programs on the Living Shoreline Collaborative website, right? All the partners. So go to the link above, and you can get that information. And we're now past the break and running into the home stretch. So it looks like that's all the questions, and I think I answered them all. and Trevor, I think what you said basically is right now it's just grass, but there will be a seed mix that'll be put there in place in the future.
That's correct. In most areas right now, there's a kind of like a contractor's mix, especially with E&S controls and measures that we take. We want to stabilize that as quickly as possible. Whole purpose of the project being to reduce sediment erosion going into Gordon's Creek and the Chickahominy. So want to provide some kind of stabilization before we could get more of a native riparian mix established in that area. So.
Great. And I wanted to also mention very quickly, the Lafayette Wetlands Partnership. They're a pretty amazing group, and they actually put together a whole manual for their volunteers on living shoreline wetlands restoration projects. And it's pretty amazing. So ex-Navy people involved. They've got a program. So anyway, I'm going to turn it back over to Emily. Is that who I turn it back over to, or is it Ryan?
It's me.
Okay, I'll shut up then.
All right, so now's the part where we preview some upcoming Living Shorelines projects. So I'll go ahead and get the ball rolling. JRA's next Living Shoreline, I actually just got the email a little bit ago. It's going to be construction starts on March 2nd. So that's going to be at Windsor Castle Park in Isle of Wight County, adjacent to the public kayak launch there. There's an eroding headland that's being affected by tidal action as well as boat wake, and occasionally probably from nor'easters. But we're building a multi-section living shoreline there. Some other projects we have coming up. We've launched our Living Shoreline Cost Share program. Beginning in January, we started site visits, visiting homeowners with that. That's wrapping up. So now we're going to begin assigning sites and designing shorelines, and those will be built over the coming months. So I haven't been able to really monitor the chat too much. Do we have people who mentioned any upcoming living shoreline projects for this coming year?
Yes, but I don't think I can read them all. I think there are probably about 10. I could go back through if you'd like.
You don't have to go through all of them, just a few.
It was during lunch. It's pretty far back.
Yeah, well, I think part of the idea here, I did copy down the projects that people shared, but if you dropped a project in the chat box and you'd like to share more about it, now would be a great time to do that. Or, if you didn't include it during lunch, that would be fine too, if there's a project you'd like to share with the group.
I will.
Awesome.
What I put in, basically where we are, I'm talking with, we're going to start working on March, the first week of March, on the Talos Beach Free Harbor Refuge. And then I'm also talking to 2 adjacent property owners who's lost significant, probably like 60 feet or more of their property in the James River. So, so those are the first ones that we want to work with on our demonstration and pilot program. And then after that, we'll expand up. And I'm glad to see that somebody else that was on the call that I know, she texted me and let me know she was on here too. So hopefully we'll be going all the way up the James on the Surrey side of the James River. But those are the 2 that we really need to start in March so that we can know what type of funding we need, what kind of design funding we need. And then we'll also have 3 interns and 1 supervisor assigned to this. So that's all I have.
Is there anyone else who would like to share any projects that they're going to be working on or installing?
Well, this is Justin with Norfolk. We don't have any more of our big, massive projects, unfortunately, right now. But we do have a few smaller areas, one around an outfall out on the eastern branch along Pleasant Point Road, and another on on either side of the Granby Street Willowwood Bridge area there on the Lafayette, like I mentioned in the presentation. We're going to try to fix up the 2 corners that are eroding badly. Have some others outside the James River watershed, but we're always looking for opportunities. So if anybody sees a good site, let me know.
Excellent.
Another county project that we have going on is at the Jamestown Marina. It goes straight into the James River as well. It's another living shoreline project, basically an old bulkhead system that was failing that we're now replacing with a lot of marsh grasses and behind a lot of boat slips, things like that. So that one's also in the process of being implemented, but should be a good one as well.
It's actually just a minute up the road from our office, so that'll be cool to check out when that's done.
I forgot to mention the work that Hampton's doing, and they're doing a big tidal creek restoration project right now through the NIFWF grant and JRA's efforts. So I just wanted to share that too, because that's a huge project.
Sure. All right. Well, if there's anything else, looks like next, Katie from CBF has a slide. So Katie, are you ready to present?
I don't have a slide. I'm just and I'm sorry, there's a construction going on.
19 on the notes.
Am I supposed to show a slide? I'm sorry.
Here, I've actually got them, so I'll share my screen.
Okay.
And I apologize. My neighbor is actually doing some construction, so life working from home. But I just wanted to mention that we do have the Chesapeake Bay Foundation is putting on a webinar tonight for the Bay Act, current, past, and future. It's actually going to be addressing the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act, and it's going to be talking about the history of the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act. It's also going to be talking about current regulation changes, and then what you can do to kind of get your opinion in there. So if you'd like to register for that, it's going to be from 6:30 to 7:30 tonight.
Okay, thank you so much. And then next is Karen from VIMS.
Hi again, everybody. We have a couple of opportunities coming up. The first one, I apologize, it's still a work in progress with the details, but Scott Hardaway, Donna Milligan, and I are offering the next Living Shoreline Design course. This is intended for living shoreline professionals and Chesapeake Bay landscape professionals, followed by coastal managers and government staff. We're limited to 40 for this course. We don't want to leave people out, but we are trying to address the need expressed by the Virginia Coastal Zone Management Program, that there's a need for more professionals who can install and maintain living shoreline projects. So that's going to be the level of information is somewhat advanced. Some experience working on tidal shorelines is very helpful. That'll be March 24th. It's a webinar, but we're also going to have some asynchronous learning associated with it, following the role model of Shireen in the Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professional, of doing this little bit of asynchronous learning and then having a 2-hour group interactive webinar. And that's on March 24th. It's currently scheduled from 10 to 12 in the morning, the webinar portion. If you're interested in that, send me an email and I'll put you on the list. We're still working out the registration issues and things like that, but I wanted to go ahead and tell this group about it in case you were interested. Let me know and we'll try to get you in. And then our annual wetlands workshop, we have funding from the Coastal Zone Management Program also to provide an annual networking opportunity for shoreline managers. Many of you have come to VIMS on several occasions to attend those, but we're not able to do that right now. We have to decide, we have to make a decision and schedule these things. So we're kind of in the works right now of thinking of another webinar series like we did last summer. We had a 3-part webinar series. I'm voting for a 2-part webinar series this time dedicated exclusively to living shorelines. That's what I'm starting to work a program together. And if you have any topics or speaker suggestions to sort of keep going with this, keep the momentum of those success stories going. Those were awesome to hear about. That's the kind of thing we want to keep going with. If you have any thoughts or suggestions, let me know. We have not picked a date yet, but it will be the summer again, probably August, like we did last year.
Okay, then next is Shireen and then me.
So we are in the middle of training season right now. We're wrapping up our level 1 winter training. And on the 24th, we actually have a maintenance and cost estimating workshop called an invitation to bid. And that's being run and designed by a certified CBLP who is in maintenance, and he wants to move the maintenance world into sustainable maintenance. We have our level 2 seminar and certification coming up. I have RISE partial scholarships for all trainings and workshops if you live and or work in the Hampton Roads area. So contact me if you're interested and I'll give you some partial scholarships. We also started today's menu. They're free webinars for our certified pros, and the next one coming up is caring for mature trees. That's a lunch and learn. We'll do our level 1 training and certification starting in late June through early September, and our field day. We have a 1-day field practicum at the end of the training. The rest is online, and that is going to be the first week of September at ODU. We started a buffer certificate course dealing with training for riparian buffers. And we did that in partnership with the James River Association in the middle and upper James River. But we're also going to be repeating that series of courses starting in the summer. And I'm going to be running a urban buffer design workshop. Most of the buffers for the upper and middle James have focused on the agricultural and rural and large scale buffers. We're also going to do a sourcing native plants online workshop in the summer of 2021. I started the CBLP Associate Certificate Program that is focused on training and getting a certificate for youth, high school to recent graduates. And it's kind of a combination of workforce development and green infrastructure and living shorelines, as well as mentoring for careers in environmental fields. And I just got a question from somebody in Virginia Beach and the Virginia Beach schools to see if I would be interested in bringing the certificate program to their environmental studies program. So I'm excited about that. We'll be working on the Living Shoreline certificate program development, starting as soon as we get information about when the grant funding becomes available, but probably start in the spring when things slow down with training. And then the CCLC, which is one of the parent organizations, Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, has every 2 years, they have a Turning a New Leaf conference, which is great. And we're going to do local field trips. And Barbara Gavin and I are on their board, and we'll be doing a field trip in the Hampton Roads area. And that's December 8th through the 10th. And I think that's it.
Okay, so one of the last things we're going to do for our National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grant is a series of site visits through this Living Shoreline Collaborative. And it's the exact dates and locations are to be determined. We would like to do this in the spring when the plants are nice and green and you can see where things are living and what exactly is growing there. But we hope to bring localities, such as Hampton, so they can impart knowledge about things that they've learned through installing the living shorelines, as well as our own experiences and mistakes that we've made along the way. And that's it.
All right, guys. Thank you, Ryan and Shireen and Katie and Karen for for sharing that, as well as all the folks who were talking about some of their upcoming projects. That sounds really exciting. So we're a little bit ahead of schedule, which is just fine. But I want to thank everybody for sticking with us as we switch the summit to a virtual format. I hope that next year we're able to do this face-to-face once again. Before we have our closing remarks, I'm going to ask Amber to share the link to the summit evaluation in the chat. And I'll also share this later via email. So, we want to hear about your experience today, but also how you might want to be involved with the collaborative in the future. We're also always interested in hearing about what folks have taken away from an event like this. So if you've learned something new, made a new connection with someone, anything like that, had an aha moment, please drop those in the chat. We love to hear about it. Karen During shared one with me earlier. She had an aha moment during Justin Shafer's presentation on the projects in Norfolk, pointing out the need for the continuity of programs regardless of the people participating, and how he had such a great point about the unique connections that citizen participants bring to the table, specifically in their ability to put pressure on elected officials. So that was her moment. And if you have anything else, something learned, anything like that, please leave it in the chat for us. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to one of our LSC partners, our collaborative partners, Christy Everett. Christy is the Hampton Roads Director of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and she's going to introduce our closing speaker.
Great, thanks. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay,
yes.
Fantastic. Great. Thanks so much. So as Aaron mentioned in his presentation, the administration of Virginia has done a lot for living shorelines, not only over the past few years, but gosh, over the past few decades in a number of different roles. So we just wanted to bring in a spokesperson from the administration to talk a little bit about kind of living shorelines and how they fit into the bigger picture of current priorities of the administration. So we've got Ellen Bolin here today. And Ellen, a wonderful partner and friend to Conservation Natural Resources in Virginia. She was appointed to Virginia Marine Resources Commission as the Deputy Director in 2008. Prior to her appointment, she served as Senior Advisor to the Administration and the Undersecretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere at the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, where she worked on fishery and coastal policies. She's also held roles as Director at the Fishery Conservation Program and Associate Director of Government Relations at Ocean Conservancy, as well as a field biologist at Mote Marine Laboratory. She graduated from the Master's in Environmental Management Program and Nicholas School for the Environment at Duke University and received a Bachelor of Science degree in Zoology from the University of Oklahoma. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ellen to provide some remarks.
Thanks. I'm assuming y'all can hear me. I see a lot of nodding heads and thumbs up. So I realize I'm at the end of your day and you guys have been staring at screens for several hours. So I will keep my remarks short. On behalf of the Commonwealth and Secretary Strickler, really wanted to thank you all for your time here today and for the work of the collaborative in making living shorelines a reality. The Chesapeake Bay brings so much to the Commonwealth, as we all know: tourism, fishing. It has both big ecological and economic impacts. And a big part of that is ensuring that we have a healthy bay. And as many of us have seen over the years, there have been some sectors that have struggled and there have been some step backs. But this administration has really committed to restoring a healthy bay and meeting those agreements we've set forth and meeting those restoration targets we've set forth in the Bay Agreement. And part of this, the roadmaps that we use are the watershed implementation plans that govern total nutrient daily loads, our pollution diet. But a big part of this will be living shorelines. And one of the things I find interesting when we talk about restoration is we talk in big numbers, right? The bay is huge. We talk in millions of miles of ocean. We talk in thousands of miles of coastline. We talk in $10 million for oyster restoration from this administration. We talk in $3.5 million for water quality and agricultural based management practices. But sometimes with these really big numbers and big projects, we can lose sight of the fact that it's the smaller pieces. It's the restoration work on the ground. It is the mile by mile of living shoreline. It is the acre by acre of oyster reef. That is actually what gets us to our restoration goals. And I think that's why living shorelines are such an interesting part of our restoration program, because it is definitely a tool where the sum of the parts really is what drives us towards that restoration and gives us a chance to talk to a lot of people who may not be as in tune to the importance of restoration. So as Christy mentioned, living shorelines in Virginia kind of got their start in 2011 when the General Assembly codified a preference for the use of living shorelines. This is the first time we started really talking about how we can improve how we use our coastlines and that how we use our coastline matters, even in smaller segments. Then more recently, during the 2020 legislative session, we changed that from a preferred method to a required method. So the code now says that we can only do living shoreline approaches to shoreline management unless the best available science says otherwise. But the code change also includes an interesting thing that I think is also an important part of restoration, is the code and the policies say, okay, even if best available science says you can't do a whole living shoreline, you can do parts of it. And I think it's, as we look at restoration in the Commonwealth and we want to have uptake by everybody, by citizens, by municipalities, by the feds, I think it's important to lay out the fact that small steps, even if you can't do a full living shoreline, still matter. That those smaller steps are really what adds up to the bigger picture in the Bay. So I joke I'm not from Virginia, but the phrase I use is that every state's a coastal state. And I think every restoration project is a coastal restoration project because we see the work that we do in the upper watersheds of the Bay matters in the waters outside our door. And living shorelines are right on that edge, right? That's where we're transitioning from the land management practices to the shoreline practices. And I think are a critical buffer and how we can reduce nutrient runoff into the Bay and improve coastal resources. They provide a number of functions. They clean the water, they filter pollution, they provide coastal habitat for nesting turtles and shorebirds, and then they improve shallow water habitat for many plant and animal species, underwater grasses, the iconic blue crab, and various types of finfish. And so these small pieces of living shoreline, so for example, in 2020, our MRC Habitat staff ran the numbers. We had about 172 projects for 9.2 miles of living shoreline requested. But these 170 projects, 9.2 miles of shoreline, will have a much greater ripple effect out through the Bay that protects our natural resources and really drives us towards restoration. And without the work you guys are doing as part of the collaborative, we wouldn't see people, learn more about them and begin to put these small pieces of restoration together to drive towards our goal. So thank you everybody for your time today. And I'm excited to see what's next.
Thank you so much, Ellen, for that. And thank you for joining us today. And with that, that's the conclusion of our program. So I will share that evaluation with the group via email, as well as some follow-up materials. And I hope you guys get to enjoy some of this beautiful day.
And thank you to Emily, Ryan, Amber, everybody who was working for many hours behind the scenes to get this all ready. What a great program we had today. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Great job.
Great job, guys.
Thank you. Great job.